for joining us. My name is Katie Perez, and I'm a senior associate here at Scott Legal PC. So today we're going to spend some time talking about the options for E-2 visas with lower investment amounts and businesses often considered high risk, such as those involved with real estate, equity trading firms, or consulting businesses. So just a few things before we get started. Some of you may know that our firm was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the U.S. on an E-2 visa and has been on several different visas, including an F1, a TN, and an H-1B. Scott Legal PC is a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in several different areas, including E-2, E-1, TN, L-1, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB-5, extraordinary ability visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E-2 visas, and we typically process E-2 visas that are considered higher risk, such as those with lower investment amounts. We have processed at consulates around the world, but primarily the two consulates we process at are Toronto and London. We will continue this webinar series doing at least 2 webinars a week on different topics. At the end of this webinar, we will send out several useful tools. We will send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation from today, a link where you can download the guides that go through the visa options in more detail, and also a link where you can sign up for additional webinars. So this webinar will be recorded and will be available on YouTube. We'll also send the link for that, and we encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly do upload immigration videos on a wide variety of topics. We'll also send you a link where you can arrange a consultation with one of our experienced immigration attorneys if you would like to discuss your case in more detail. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the webinar. So today I will be presenting the first half of the webinar, and we are also joined by our partner, Kelly Weiner. Kelly is a partner here at Scott Legal, and she has extensive experience working with employment-based visas and processing the E-2 visa petitions, especially those that are considered higher risk. Okay, so without further delay, we will get started. Okay, so we're going to start with discussing just the E-2 visa requirements first. So in order to be eligible for the E-2 visa, you must be a national of a treaty country. This means that you need to hold a passport from an E-2 treaty country. So the Department of State does provide a list that's available online where you can see a list of those E-2 treaty countries. And occasionally the list is updated with additions or changes, but currently there are over 80 listed countries on there. So, as I stated, you need to hold a passport from an E-2 treaty country. However, you don't need to have been born in an E-2 treaty country, so that you do have a little bit of flexibility. So, for example, if you were born in India and you hold a passport from India, but your parents were born in Australia and you have Australian citizenship through your parents and you hold an Australian passport, you would be eligible for that E-2 visa based on your nationality requirement. So even if you had never been to Australia, because you have that Australian passport. So the fact that you would have that additional passport from Australia means that you satisfy that nationality requirement. So another requirement is that you must own at least 50% of the E-2 visa company. The business can take almost any form. This can be an LLC, a corporation, but you just need to own at least 50% of that company. You can own exactly 50%, you can own 100%, however, you can't own less than 50%. So 49.5% would not be sufficient. So the moment your ownership drops below that 50% mark, you actually become ineligible for that E-2 visa. So it is important to keep in mind, even if you do receive that E-2 visa going forward, if you decide you want to sell equity in the company, it could be detrimental to your E-2 visa eligibility later on. So you need to be cognizant of your ownership interest in the company throughout the duration of your E-2 visa. Let's see. So with the E-2 visa, you can also have more than one investor for one company. So you can have two E-2 investors supported by one E-2 company. So for an example, if you have an Italian passport and you have a friend who's an Australian citizen, and you both want to go into this E-2 venture, if you each own 50% of the company, then you can each apply for this E-2 investor visa. As a side note, you would each need to satisfy all the requirements individually for that E-2 visa, but it is certainly possible to have two E-2 investors who own 50% of the same company. So another requirement is that you must make a substantial investment in the business. A common question we get is, how much do I need to invest in the business and what is substantial? So there is not an exact dollar amount listed in the E-2 visa regulations, but in general, when you're trying to determine what a substantial investment is, you should first consider what amount of money is sufficient to make this business fully operational. So you need to consider, have you purchased everything the business needs to be fully operational? For example, do you have the equipment, the licenses, a lease agreement, or the inventory? So everything needed for that business. It is important to keep in mind all businesses are different. Each one has different needs. So, for example, if you are going to start a consulting company or you have a consulting company, this type of company would likely require less investment to make fully operational versus a manufacturing plant. Um, so after you consider what amount of money would be needed to make this fully operational, you do also need to consider, have you invested a minimal amount in the eyes of the government officer to be considered substantial. So again, if you are doing a consulting business, you may be able to make your business fully operational for just $5,000. Maybe you just have a computer, laptop, and you rent a space for your location where you can operate out of. However, so you can make the business fully operational for maybe just $5,000, but this is generally not going to be sufficient in the eyes of the government. They won't necessarily consider this to be a substantial investment. So there is a second step to this analysis where you do need to consider one, um, did you spend enough to make the business fully operational? And then two, have you invested just the minimal amount in the eyes of the government where they will think that you made a substantial investment? So generally, we recommend to our clients that you invest at least $50,000 in the business. Again, it will depend on the type of business you plan to operate because all businesses are different. Okay, so another requirement is that your funds must be at risk. This means it's not enough to simply just set up your business account and put all your funds in that bank account. So you need to actually spend the funds on the business. So if you transfer $100,000 from your personal bank account into the E-2 business bank account, you would then need to spend those funds on things that make the business operational. So, for example, you would take those funds and spend it on a commercial lease agreement or your inventory, other equipment, marketing fees, legal fees, other things to set up the business. So, you want to show the government officer that you've bought everything the business needs to be fully operational and you've spent the funds, the investment funds. As a note, it is okay to keep some of the funds for working capital. So again, for example, if you have $100,000 as your investment, and you've spent maybe 75, 80% of those funds on items like the rent, inventory, equipment, that sort of thing, you can keep some of it in the bank account for working capital. That would be permissible. We would still say your investment amount is $100,000, but we would just, you would make a note to the government letting them know that those funds are working capital. Okay, so next requirement is the source of funds. So the government needs to be satisfied that the source of funds is from lawful and legitimate means. The scope of what is acceptable is quite broad, so you can use gifts from family members, from friends. You can use loans as long as the loans are secured by your personal assets, not the E-2 business. You can use inheritance. You can use income earned from your employment over the course of several years. So the government is very accepting of many types of sources as long as those sources are lawful and legitimate. We do emphasize that the government can have a high documentation requirement related to the source of funds. So you do need to make sure that you have the documents showing exactly where you obtained the funds from. This is especially the case if you're here in the United States and you're applying for that E-2 visa through USCIS. USCIS can be very strict about the source of funds and the documentation required. Um, Conversely, most consulates do have a page limit, so they don't actually spend too much time looking at the source of funds. However, you would need to make sure if you apply at a consulate, you still want to have the documentation showing where you received the source of funds in case the consulate does inquire about it. So how much is enough? We will talk about this a little bit later on in the presentation, but you do want to keep in mind the type of business you're starting and what are the reasonable startup costs associated with that type of business. So you're going to consider the type of business, what does this business really need to make it fully operational? Okay. So typical E-2 expenditures, these generally include um, things I mentioned earlier. So your inventory, the equipment, website setup, office supplies, your office warehouse rent, fees spent on marketing, or fees spent on other business entity setup. So maybe your licenses or things like that. So when you are trying to consider the type of expenditures to include, you should just again consider what does the business need to be operational. So that is just really important concept going forward when you're trying to put together your E-2 visa petition. If needed, you would want to just show the government that the business has purchased everything it needs in order to be fully operational tomorrow. So if you're starting again a restaurant, you need to maybe have a health license. Maybe you already do have the license or you've applied for it, that sort of thing. You're showing the government you're ready to go and this business is ready to be operational tomorrow. Okay, so a few more requirements. You do need to show there's a requirement called the marginality requirement, which means that the business needs to support more than just the investor and the investor's family. So the way this translates is that you must show that you're going to hire U.S. workers in the U.S. that will work at your business. Or there's another possibility. You could purchase a business too, which already employs those U.S. workers. But to kind of satisfy this requirement, we typically recommend that the business should employ at least 3 full-time U.S. workers within 5 years of starting the business operations. So this is a bit of a broad statement, and it won't apply to every single business. But in general, if the E-2 company employs 3 full-time U.S. workers, and the company is typically not going to have issues when you renew that E-2 visa with the government based on this marginality requirement. So 3 full-time U.S. workers within 5 years of starting those operations is a pretty good baseline to keep in mind. So the earlier you can start hiring, the better. If you can start hiring even before you submit the application, then this can significantly strengthen the application. So again, since we are talking about riskier applications or lower investment amounts, one consideration you could think about would be using some of your investment funds to actually hire a U.S. worker early on. So this can help an officer see that in spite of your low investment, this is a company that is likely to employ U.S. workers because you already have one U.S. employee. So if you are able to show the officer early on that you can satisfy this requirement, you're going to hire those U.S. workers, and other parts of the application become a little less important. Conversely, if you're able to show that you have a very high investment amount, but you're not actually going to hire any U.S. workers, and your petition would likely be denied. So you can keep that in mind. The next requirement is that the business does need to be real in operating. So the business doesn't need to be actually operating before you submit the petition. What this requirement means is that the moment you arrive in the U.S. with that E-2 visa, you're ready just to begin operating the business. Again, you want to show the officer that you have everything the business needs to be fully operational, and you want to put this all in the application to show you've taken all the necessary steps. So once you enter the U.S., the business is ready to go. Things you can really show or provide to the officer, again, to show that it's going to be is real and operating, would be your lease agreement. You have all the equipment, you have the office space, things like that, the inventory, if that's part of the business setup. Let's see. Other things you can include too for the real and operating would be if you have already hired a worker, maybe you have payroll records. If you have contracts with clients, something like that, you can also provide to the government to show the company is actually real and operating. Let's see. So another requirement for the E-2 visa is that you need to be coming to the U.S. to direct and develop the business. This means that you, as that E-2 investor, will be coming to really focus on developing, directing the business. You're the one in charge. So you can come to work for the business, but the government officer doesn't want to see that you're the employee who will be performing all those operational duties, that sort of thing. Another thing to keep in mind for this requirement as the one who's going to come direct and develop the business is that if you're approved for an E-2 visa, you're approved to work at just that company. So you wouldn't be able to come to the U.S. under that E-2 visa and work and have like a side job or a part-time job. If you were going to do something like that, you would need to apply with the government with another separate petition. So that E-2 visa gives you just the ability to work for that company only. You do need to be qualified to work at this business, but sometimes people don't have any experience working in the industry that they are actually going to enter and start this business within. This is generally a low bar to show that you are qualified to work at the E-2 enterprise, but it does require an explanation. If you can just provide that explanation for the officer, connect the dots, and really explain how you are qualified to direct and develop the business, then it's not too big of a hurdle to overcome. So again, you do need to have ownership of at least 50%. The screen here says ownership of greater than 50%, but the benchmark is just 50%. So you can own, again, you can own more. It could be 75%, 80%, 100%, but 50% is sufficient. Regarding the ownership, you do need to show you have control of the business. This would kind of even relate to directing and developing business requirement. So you need to be able to have that power to make the business decisions. One other note on this that typically is applied within the USCIS applications, you do need to be careful if, again, I kind of mentioned before that you don't want to show USCIS or the government that you're going to be the sole employee within the business. So you do want to be able to explain to the government who will be performing those operational duties. So it would be a little bit of a riskier application if you show USCIS that you're not going to hire anybody for 2 or 3 years to perform those operational duties. They might really question if you're coming here to direct and develop the business versus just working at this E-2 enterprise, not really hiring those U.S. workers. So another requirement is that you do need to have the intent to return to your home country upon expiration of that E-2 visa. The E-2 visa is not a green card. It is a temporary non-immigrant visa, which means you're allowed to enter the U.S. for just a temporary period of time to accomplish a specific purpose, which for the E-2 visa would be to direct and develop that business. This does not mean that you can't renew the E-2 visa. You can actually renew it indefinitely as long as you remain eligible and your company remains eligible. The requirement is saying really that you just, the E-2 visa, the intent behind the visa is that it's a temporary visa. It is fine later on if your plans change and maybe you do decide to apply for a green card, but just overall, you keep in mind that the E-2 visa is a temporary visa. Okay, so under the E-2 visa, you can also, there are a few different options. So you can start a new business, or you can even purchase an existing business. You can even start a franchise. Those are all fairly common within the E-2 visa. If you're buying a business, a few things to keep in mind would be that if this business that you're planning to purchase has already been operational for a few years, then you do want to look at that business very carefully and kind of see, has this business already hired U.S. workers? If you're purchasing a business and it's run by one person, and you're going to then use this for the E-2 visa, the government might be very critical and have a lot of questions about whether or not you can satisfy the marginality requirement, because here you're about to buy a business that has is run by one person. There's no U.S. workers. The government might say, how are you planning to hire U.S. workers if the business doesn't really need them? Um, so if you're buying a business, there's no U.S. workers or very few, you're actually creating quite a big hurdle for yourself to overcome. Instead, it would be better if you're going to purchase a business to purchase one that already has U.S. workers. So you can really position yourself strongly from the beginning before you submit the application to the government. Again, franchises can be a good option because you already have the infrastructure of the franchise that will support you. If you are buying a business and you're concerned with putting a significant amount of money on the line to buy that business, one option you do have is what we call is called escrow. So escrow is that one exception to the requirement that your investment needs to be at risk. Previously, we said it's not enough to just put your funds in a bank account and say it's at risk. You normally need to spend the funds. But here with the escrow, there's an exception. So if you do put your funds in an escrow account under the condition that the funds will be released from escrow to the seller of the business immediately upon issuance of the visa, this is permissible. So the issuance of the visa is that one condition. So if you have any other conditions put on that escrow, then it wouldn't be accepted by the government. But if it's just that one condition that the funds will be released once you get the visa, then it's generally fine to put the funds in an escrow account. Okay, so how long is the E-2 visa valid? The validity dates of an E-2 visa can vary from 3 months to 5 years, and the amount of time that you get depends on the agreement that the U.S. has with that E-2 treaty country, which is the country that you have the passport from. So you do need to keep in mind that the reciprocity table might say that you can get a visa for 5 years, but the officer who is adjudicating your petition does have discretion to limit the length of the visa. Reasons they may limit the length of the visa could just include how they view the case. So maybe they think the case isn't that strong, or they want you to come back sooner to really see whether or not you have hired those U.S. workers, that sort of thing. So, once you have that visa, the valid visa means you can seek entry into the U.S. When an E-2 investor enters the U.S., CBP will issue you what is called the Form I-94. So, for E-2 status holders, this I-94 typically grants 2 years of authorized stay. And each time you enter the U.S. In valid E-2 status, the CBP officer will generally issue you a new I-94 showing you 2 years of authorized stay. So the I-94 is independent of the visa stamp expiration in most cases. So it's important to keep that in mind. The I-94, when you're here in the U.S., does serve as proof that you're authorized to be here, that you're authorized to work for that E-2 company. So as long as your I-94 admit date is still valid, you're still legally allowed to work here in the United States for that qualifying business. Again, each time you leave the U.S. and re-enter, CBP will typically issue you a fresh I-94, again, extending your ability to stay and work here in the U.S. So regardless of whether your visa is valid for 3 months or 5 years, you typically just get that 2 years of E-2 status when you enter the U.S. from CBP. The moment you leave the U.S. is the moment that E-2 visa validity period becomes relevant again. So if you are from a country where you only get that 3-month visa, but you had the 2 years of E-2 status from the I-94, you could stay here in the U.S. for 2 years. But if you decide you want to travel and the 3-month visa has expired, you would need to return to the consulate where you got that visa and renew it and get another visa. So people who come from countries where the visa validity is dates don't offer that much time. For example, you come from a country where you only get that 3-month validity period on the visa. Typically, people will tend to apply for an extension through USCIS, where you can get that another 2 years. Okay. So, how much is enough? So we did touch upon this earlier in the presentation, but again, the law doesn't provide a specific dollar amount that you might find like within the EB-5s. The law for the E-2 says that you must invest a substantial amount. So the negative here, there's like a little bit of uncertainty when you are applying with the government, but the positive is that there are opportunities to get your E-2 visa approved with even a fairly low investment amount. The important thing to consider and think about is and really show the government that you have invested enough for this business to be fully operational, and showing that you have really invested that minimum amount in the eyes of the government officer. So again, we typically recommend you invest at least $50,000, but you would again need to consider the type of business. What are the needs of the business that you're planning to open? So again, if you're going to open a manufacturing plant, the investment required to make this business fully operational would be significantly higher than if you're going to start a consulting company. Once you have hit that minimum amount and you've invested enough for the business to be fully operational, we typically don't see an issue with the investment amount. So it does really just need to, it just really does depend on the type of business and what is needed for that business to be fully operational. So we already touched upon to you that the money does need to be spent. You cannot just place the funds in a bank account and let it sit there and tell the government that you've made an investment. They want to see the expenditures. They want to see the invoices. They want to see where you spent the money for this business. The government does have something called the proportionality test. We won't dive too deep into it, but the test compares the amount you've invested to the total cost of the business that you're buying or you're creating. So the question is really whether your investment represents a meaningful percentage of what is required for the business to function successfully. The test works on a sliding scale, so if the business costs less to open and start, the government would require a higher percentage of your investment. So, for example, if you're starting a small business and it costs $100,000 to be operational, the government would likely expect you to invest close to $100,000 of the total cost. Conversely, a higher cost business would require a lower percentage of investment. So if you're, again, opening a manufacturing plant that costs millions of dollars to get it up and running, a smaller percentage of an investment may be substantial and may be sufficient if it's a larger project. Okay, so we'll discuss just a little bit about strategies to deal with the low investment amount. So, one of the first things we would recommend doing, or as your attorney, what we would do is just really try to look at the application as a whole. After looking at the application as a whole, you would really want to identify the positive factors of the case and emphasize those. So, positive factors, if you have a lower investment amount, again, might be have you already hired a U.S. worker, a few U.S. workers? Do you have contracts with clients? Have you previously run a similar business abroad? Those types of things. They can really support that and show the government, hey, this person is opening the business. We already have a really, we're ready to go up and running. We'll hire U.S. workers. Even though the investment amount might be lower, the positives can outweigh the negative. So the investment amount, again, is just one of several factors the government will look at when they're looking at your case. If you do have that low investment amount, but you've hired the three U.S. workers, this will strengthen your case. Regarding the U.S. workers, we usually say full-time workers are best. If you can't hire full-time workers, then maybe you can do a few part-time workers. If you don't have part-time workers, maybe you do have independent contractors. So all these types of things can help support the petition. The different type of workers, whether or not they're part-time or independent contractors, are all better options than not having any U.S. workers. Other ways you can show that your company is likely to be successful and likely to employ U.S. workers is to show the government, that you have an interest in your products or your services. So again, maybe you already have contracts signed up, or you have letters of intent from different clients. So those are all positive things you can show the government that despite the low investment amount, you are prepared to be operational. You have clients ready to go. People sometimes also obtain a Chamber of Commerce letter saying that the business idea is likely to generate opportunities in the community and be an important part of the community. That can also support your petition. Sometimes people get a letter from a certified public accountant, which says that the CPA has seen this type of business before, and the amount invested is generally sufficient for this type of business. Something else you might want to do to help deal with the low investment amount would be to have a business plan drafted for you. A strong business plan would be very important to support your E-2 visa. Even if you have large investment or low investment, the government does really want to see this business plan. So generally, you'll provide a business plan that covers, 1 to 5 years. It will include your hiring plan, an explanation of how you plan to operate, how you plan to generate business, that sort of thing. Okay, so we'll discuss just a little bit about common E-2 visa expenditures. So E-2 business expenditures are expenses that are needed for the business. So, and if the expenditure is needed for the business, then generally it will be considered to be a strong expense, and you would want to include that as part of your petition. So common expenditures we generally see or would expect to see within the E-2 visa petition would include, website setup, purchasing of computers, printers, scanners, tablets, that sort of thing. Another would be inventory. So you can have the inventory shipped from a different country, but it doesn't have to be purchased in the U.S. Furniture, only if it's used for business purposes. So you can't go purchase a new couch and use it at your house and call it an expenditure. Other types would be trademark, intellectual property, employee payroll, independent contractor payments, legal fees, your lease agreement and payments made for the lease. Sometimes if you want to show you've spent more money, invested more money, you can even prepay the rent for a number of months. But you can only include as expenditures the actual months you've already paid for. You can include software, advertising, or even office supplies as well. Okay, so we are going to now switch over to our partner, Kelly, and Kelly's going to continue to discuss what would be considered a weak expenditure. So switch over to Kelly.
Thank you, Katie. So some weak expenditures would be things like travel. So, amounts paid for flights, hotel, food. And people will often say, well, I need to come to the United States to kind of get my business set up. And unfortunately, these types of expenses are just not considered to be strong. They're not considered to be kind of directly related to the setup of the E-2 company. In fact, some consulates go so far as to, in their frequently asked questions section, they'll even say, please don't include, travel. Please don't include, receipts for food or, meetings or anything like that. So travel, flights, these travel accommodations, hotel, any transportation like taxis, entertainment, none of that is kind of a strong expenditure for the E2. And if you do include any of it, it should be a very minimal amount of your investment. Uh, so a car or a vehicle, now this really depends on the type of business you're starting. So let's say you are starting, a mobile, kind of grooming company or a construction company where you need a truck to kind of, bring things with you, like tools and things like that. In those cases, so if you're getting a mobile, grooming company and you need kind of a big truck for that, or, you need like a food truck, if you're doing construction, you need your big truck. If it's going to be primarily used for the business, then this can be a good expense for the E2. But if it's just, well, I need a car because I'm going to need to drive to work, or I'm a consultant and I'll need to drive to my clients, then it's much, less of a strong expenditure. So if it's a car that you're going to use for work, for a regular commute, and then also use for kind of your personal use, then this indicates it's really not a strong E2 expense. If it's something where maybe it's going to be a branded, vehicle that has advertising for your company on it, or it's needed because it's a type of business like a mobile groomer or a food truck, then it can be, a reasonable expenditure. Another thing to watch out for are expenses paid to related parties. So let's say that, you are starting a company in the United States and you have a related company but you own a company as well in Germany, and that company does website design. It's not a good expense to have your E2 company pay your German company for that website design. It's something where if the officer kind of looks into it and they discover, well, you own both companies, they're not going to feel that the money is really being put at risk. It seems much more like you're just paying yourself. This is similar if you are, like, let's say it's your spouse's company. So you do want to be careful with those types of expenditures. It's not that they can never be included, but it shouldn't be the bulk of your expenditure. And you do want to watch out for it, especially if you own both companies, then it's really not a good expenditure. It doesn't look like you've put money at risk in the commercial sense, and it's much better to spend the money, with another vendor, and particularly one who's already in the United States. So we can go to the next slide. All right, let's talk about some challenges and tips for consulting businesses. So, consulting businesses are we do them very frequently. And while they can be very viable E2 businesses, there are some particular challenges we want to talk about. So, one challenge is that theoretically, a very low investment or even no investment is really needed to start a consulting business. It's a really common question that we get, from clients who say, I want an E2, but what could I spend money on? I just don't have enough that I could spend, 50,000 or 60,000, to get things up and running. And for the E2 visa, you do have to demonstrate that you're committed to successfully operating the enterprise. So, unfortunately, what that means is that sometimes what you would do as an entrepreneur, where you would spend as little as possible, to make sure that, you're not kind of overextending yourself. For the E2, you do have to get comfortable with the idea that you're going to have to spend money. That is just part of what is required to make that substantial investment to get the visa. And so, what we recommend is kind of to look out maybe 1 to 2 years and see what would your like large expenditures be. Did you plan to kind of hire a couple employees at the end of the year or in year two and buy them? You'll need to get them computer equipment and get a payroll provider. Did you plan to kind of engage with a marketing agency and get a really well-developed website, where you wouldn't initially do that because you have your own industry connections? So we do, try to recommend to people to make those expenditures, and maybe what you would have spent in the first 1 to 2 years of operations, maybe you spend more on that now. So maybe you engage that marketing agency now, you pay for that more expensive website, maybe you hire someone a little earlier than you planned, you get that insurance, that payroll provider set up. You maybe you don't hire anyone, but you purchase the equipment for them to use, a year in advance. Those types of things can help make sure that you're spending enough to actually get the visa, while also, showing that you're spending the money on things you actually do need for the business. So, another thing you can do is you can get articles that show how much does it cost to get this business up and running, and then point out that you've spent more than that. So, for example, trade publications, kind of business magazines, internet articles from reputable sources that talk about startup costs for certain types of businesses and what you would normally need. You can kind of insert those things into the application and show, if it says, well, you can start up a consulting business with $5,000, and you've spent 45,000 and you have 25,000 in working capital, you can show I've spent well in excess of this. Everything that is needed to get this business up and running has been spent and we're ready to go. Also, you want to spend the money in a wide range of items to, again, to show I've spent everything necessary to get this type of business up and running. I have office space. I've purchased a computer and point of sale equipment. I have a marketing plan and I've invested in marketing. I've hired employees. So you want to, again, like having one very large expenditure, like let's say you say, okay, I'm going to, spend $40,000 on a marketing agency and then buy some pens. That doesn't look good to the officer. Like again, you want to be able, you want to have them look at the investment schedule and say, yeah, this makes sense for this type of business. They've spent everything necessary. They have some office expenses. They have a printer. They have a computer. They have a phone. They have what they need to actually get this business up and running. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk about real estate investment. So real estate is something where, while this can be very viable for the E2, it is something that has a lot of scrutiny on it. So, very often if you're going in with a real estate business, officers will be very concerned, like, are you just trying to like do you have some personal vacation homes that you manage? Are you just trying to, flip one property? So they're very concerned because sometimes people have this impression that if you just purchase a property and put it in the name of an LLC, that this would be sufficient as your investment. And again, this is so common that in fact, on many consulate, FAQs, they have this, question and the answer, which is no, you cannot just, buy a house and then rent it out and have passive rental income. That's not going to be considered kind of a real and operating enterprise that qualifies for the E2. So you do have to show, you're going to have this real and operating company. Employees are going to be needed. You're going to have revenue. If you have some vacation homes, you want to rent them out, you're interested in that line of work, that's okay, but you would need to develop it much more. So, for example, maybe you have a real estate property management company and you manage your own properties, but then you manage other properties too. So it's not just kind of your passive rental income. You have an actual property management company that manages a portfolio of properties. Other kind of real estate ideas that have worked for our clients in the past, one would be kind of a brokerage firm, a renovation or construction company, and house flipping. We mentioned this, but it really only works if you're doing it on a large scale. So, for example, we had a client with a portfolio of 30 to 40 homes that were kind of being flipped. The downside of that is if you're doing that level of kind of real estate commercial development, the minimum investment is going to be very high, right? So it could be hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars because there's a lot of kind of real estate. There's a lot of expenses, and you're not going to be able to say, I've invested $50,000 and I have a house flipping company. That's not going to work to show, hey, I've spent everything necessary for this to be an active operating enterprise. You also need to think about licensing. So real estate is a very regulated industry. And for example, if you're going to be kind of a broker, there may be certain, or you're going to do construction, there may be certain requirements, or licenses that you need. For some of these licenses, it's hard to get them if you don't have a social security number already in the US. So sometimes what you'll do is you'll partner maybe with a local business, or you'll hire somebody who already has this license that can stand in for your company. But you want to be planning those things in advance, doing the research to understand the industry, because these are the types of questions they will ask you at the interview. And if you don't have a plan in place, they can say, well, how could you, be a contractor or a construction company if you don't have a general contractor's license? So you do want to keep that in mind. All right, equity trading companies, very similar kind of considerations to real estate in the sense that there is a concern, is this going to be an active and operating enterprise that will have revenue, that will hire employees? They're very concerned, are you just doing day trading? Are you just kind of doing personal investing? It's also another very regulated industry. So, if you are doing something kind of more involved, like you have a hedge fund or something. Again, you have to make sure you have the proper structure set up. You have to make sure you have the proper licenses, and that the business is actually going to support hiring U.S. workers and not just kind of a passive, investment enterprise. All right. So, what are some reasons for E2 denials? So, one would be low investment amount. So, I think we've talked today about some strategies for dealing with low investment amount cases. That being said, there are some investments that are just too low, right? So, we had a client who applied on their own and spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. You're just not going to get an E2 visa with only $2,000 spent. They won't believe that enough has been put at risk. So what is enough investment can be kind of a moving target, not only, kind of like between consulates, between USCIS. There's kind of shifting standards. That being said, you do want to be guided by what is a reasonable investment to get my particular type of business up and running, right? So if you're running a restaurant, that's going to have higher, investment requirements than a service-based company where you have much less. And if you do have a low investment amount and you have working capital, one benefit of this is that, you can just kind of spend more of the working capital to get that investment amount higher. So that can be one of the easier denial reasons to overcome if you have the capital to spend. Another might be nature of the business. So we've talked today about the fact that there are some types of businesses that just have higher scrutiny on them. So like real estate, equity trading, sometimes consulting companies. So if you do know that you have one of those riskier types of businesses, you want to build that into your strategy of how you're approaching your case, right? So if it's a consulting company and they're concerned, are you going to hire people or just be a solo consultant? Maybe you do hire someone before you file. Even though that's not required, it really does strengthen your case. Filing location and venue. So, different consulates will have kind of different expectations, and different consulates see different types of cases, right? So there are certain consulates where they're most used to seeing multinational companies that are investing millions of dollars and sending dozens of employees. Those types of consulates may be less friendly towards the small investor who's invested $75,000 and has no employees yet. There are some consulates like Toronto comes to mind, London comes to mind, where they are much more familiar with smaller owners, smaller investors and businesses, and much more, kind of able and willing to, accept and approve those applications if you can make a strong case. That being said, consular officers rotate throughout the years, trends change throughout the years. So consulates that were once very good E2 posts, sometimes, something will change and they won't be. So it's good to talk to your attorney and understand what's going on at the consulate at that particular point in time. There's kind of less flexibility with where you can apply now because there was a change that really curtailed, processing an E2 in a country other than your country of residence or citizenship. That being said, always good to know kind of what's going on in your particular consulate, so you know how realistic your chances are. So the next two reasons are kind of similar, so basically their marginality concerns. Is the company going to support more than just the investor and their family? So if you have run a similar business, let's say you've been a consultant for 10 years and you have a very successful consulting business and you've never hired anyone in your home country, it's going to be much harder for the officer to believe that you're really going to hire people, even if you have a strong business plan. So in that type of case, it is beneficial to hire someone before you file. So you want to just proactively address that concern. Will the business create jobs for U.S. workers? If you're purchasing a company and that company's been in existence for a long time and it doesn't have employees or it has, one employee, that's not a good business to purchase for the E2. Well, you can include a business plan showing how you're going to expand the business. It just, it's much better to buy a business that already has employees, if that's the route that you're going to go. Another might be issues with the adjudicating officer. So officers are, human beings. They have good days, they have bad days, they have different levels of training. And especially right now where kind of staffing has decreased, so they're doing more cases. And E2s are very specialty cases, so not every officer is trained in the same way. Unfortunately, if you do get an officer where you feel it was a difficult interview or they didn't understand the requirements, you do want to be as deferential and as polite as you can. Make your case, but be polite. They do have complete discretion over whether to grant or deny the visa, and it's very difficult to get any meaningful review if they do deny it. That being said, if they deny and you feel it was really unreasonable, there is generally an ability to reapply, and most consulates will try to give you a different officer. So it's not a guarantee, but in my experience, they really do make an effort to give you a different officer. Um, so another reason for a denial might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. Sometimes people will file the case on their own or maybe with immigration, non-immigration counsel, and it's the way it's set up just doesn't allow for an E-2 approval. For example, the treaty country national doesn't own at least 50% of the business, or perhaps, the entire thing was based on was based on seller financing and nothing has really been put at risk because the entire thing is based on a loan that's secured by the assets of the E-2 company. These are all kind of some common reasons. Again, most of the time you can reapply. The most difficult denial to overcome is one where they are questioning your credibility. So like the most difficult denial to overcome is where they feel you've, misrepresented something, you've lied about something, or they don't feel you're telling the full truth. Those are very hard to overcome because at that point, the officer has put in their notes that they don't believe you're credible. And then anything that you're saying to another officer, they may, not believe as easily. All right, so some adjudication trends. So government posted approval rates are between 80 to 90%. Our approval rate is in the high 90s, although past results don't predict future outcome. I will say, generally processing is getting more challenging in the sense that, officers are, while most interviews were maybe 5 to 10 minutes, we're hearing a lot of reports that interviews are lasting much longer, like 30 minutes and that there's much more in-depth questioning, not only about the business, but about kind of the person's background. Even though it's not official for E2s, they are kind of looking at everyone's social media accounts. So you do want to be prepared and know that kind of going in for your interview and the way you structure your application, we're in an era of kind of enhanced vetting and enforcement. And so you do want to it's more important than ever to kind of make your case as strong as possible to prepare for your interview, and be ready for those questions. In terms of timelines, London right now is taking quite a long time for E2s, somewhere between, 4 to 6 months to review. And then you're usually able to get your interview date maybe within a few weeks after that. Toronto is taking about, 1 to 2 months. So you maybe 10 to 15 days to review. And then when you log in, you can schedule an appointment and the appointments are maybe 1 to 2 months out. Sometimes you can kind of cancel and get an earlier appointment, but that's kind of the current timelines. Generally, I will say timelines vary significantly. At some consulates, you might be waiting just a few weeks. Some consulates, you're going to be waiting months. I usually advise people think in the time scale of months when you're thinking from the day you start your application until the day you get your interview. Even some consulates are taking, much longer than that, maybe even a year, although that's more of an outlier situation. Um, USCIS versus the consulate. So when you're applying for an E-2, you have two ways you can go about it. One would be to apply for an E-2 visa at the consulate. If you're outside the US and you don't have a US visa already, you're not in the US, then the consular route is the one you would take. If you're in the US in a status that allows you to change status, like let's say you're here as a B1 business visitor or you're here on an H1B, then you could apply for a change of status with USCIS to E2 status. So the benefit of a USCIS filing is if you're already here, you don't have to leave the US. There's no interview. Everything is done through the paperwork. And you will get a 2-year approval. That being said, you won't get a visa stamp in your passport that allows for international travel. So if you're somebody who needs to travel a lot, a change of status is not a good option because the minute that you leave, you'll have to go to a consulate and reapply, and they will look at that as a brand new application. They will not rely on the approval from USCIS. Additionally, a benefit of USCIS can be that they are generally more accepting of lower investment amounts than the consulates, if that makes sense for the type of business that you're starting. However, they're extremely strict on the source and trail of funds. So if you are someone who has a really complicated source and trail of funds, they will want almost a complete audit of where you got the money, where it was maintained, showing that you've maintained it the entire time up until it was spent. Whereas a consulate often takes a more holistic view. So for consular processing, benefits there is you can get that visa stamp in your passport. Many people can get a multi-year visa stamp up to 5 years. And the benefit of this is it really gives you more time to get the business, to a successful place before you have to go in and renew. Again, they also take kind of a higher level look at the source of funds, especially because most consulates have strict page limits. They're not doing that detailed audit. If you say, here's my tax returns. I've made, hundreds of thousands in the last few years, and here's the proof that I, spent it. They will be generally satisfied with that. They don't need to do that full trail that USCIS asks for. Um, so looking at, post-specific considerations, just understanding every, post, just because, your friend applied in Argentina and it was this process, you're applying in Canada, it's going to be a different process. So there are different instructions for the various consulates. There are preferences, they have page limits. Some of them want a paper filing and an email filing. Some will only accept the package if it's mailed in country. So it is very specific, and kind of getting even the package accepted has become a bit more tricky as consulates have, changed their process and require different things like a Google form to be filled out and a pre-approval, for example, in Australia. So just things to keep in mind, that it's not always simple, and you do need to really read the instructions and make sure that it's submitted properly. Um, Another thing is that some posts require a CPA certification of a business plan. So this is where you'd have to have an actual CPA prepare your business plan, or at least prepare the financials and validate those financials. And so there are certain consulates that are now requiring this, and you want to make sure in advance so that when you're hiring your business plan provider, you know that that's something that can be that is available to you. All right, some issues and complex areas for E2s. So, some of these we've covered, so I'll just go over them briefly. Do you have to hire employees before you apply? The answer is no. It's not a requirement, but it does greatly strengthen your case if you're able to do so. Complicated source and trail of funds. If you're doing a USCIS filing, as I mentioned, they're going to want every single step of that process. It's not just here's my tax returns. You'd have to show your tax returns, your pay stubs, the money entering your bank account and being maintained there. If it was transferred out, where did it go? So, keeping all of that in mind. Loans are permissible for the E2 investment if they are personal loans, either unsecured or secured by your personal assets. They cannot be secured by the assets of the E2 company. Again, this comes up a lot in seller financing, and so you want to avoid that if there's, even if it's seller financing, the security is the E2 business, but I've also done a personal guarantee. That really doesn't work well. The consulates don't like that. They still feel, even if there's a personal guarantee, the fact that the security is the E2 business, means that they won't really accept that as E2 investment. Gifts are permitted, but the gift giver does have to be willing to give you the documentation to show that it's a legitimate source of funds. So if your mom says, I'll gift you the money, but I'm not going to provide you the proof of where it's from, that doesn't work for the E2. Your mother would actually have to be willing to provide her tax returns, or if it's from a sale of property, the property sale documents. So make sure you check with that before you get a gift. E2 visas for two investors. This is possible, but it has to be a 50-50 split. Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. So changes in ownership can be problematic. Just because you get a 5-year visa, if you stop running your company or you sell 70% of your company, you're no longer maintaining your status. So you do have to maintain that 50% ownership to be a treaty investor, or the company itself has to maintain 50% ownership by treaty country nationals. Changes to the type of business, if they're substantial, need to be reported and approved ahead of time. So if you have a wedding photography business and now you're running, a restaurant, and you haven't gotten an approval for that first, that's going to be a problem at renewal. Family business purchases, they will look at this closely. Make sure you get some type of objective valuation that shows you paid the fair market value for the business. Impact of this new administration. So there's been a lot of executive orders about enhanced, vetting. We are seeing, focuses on wanting higher investment, higher employee numbers, a real focus on are you hiring US workers? Are your workers US citizens? Much more favorable to make those investments in the United States. Approval rates for E2s didn't change much from 2016 to 2020. They haven't changed that much yet, but we are again seeing this trend of more scrutiny, more questioning before they will approve. So just keep that in mind. All right, so we've reached the end of the presentation, and we do have some questions. I'm going to run through these quickly as we're getting to the end of time. Um, so somebody's asked a question about they just got their green card in Canada. They want to buy a partnership. This is a very kind of detailed fact pattern. I would suggest that you set up a consultation with us to go through it in detail because it is something that is it not kind of a simple answer that we can give kind of on a webinar. Um, but a consultation would be good for that. Um, Someone saying they've come from an IT background, they want to explore opportunities in the food industry through a franchise business model. Is it viewed negatively if you don't have prior experience? So I think that we often do cases where people do not have a specific background in that type of business. So as long as you have some demonstrable skills that could be utilized, I think it's fine, and we often do that, and it's not an issue. It is much better if you have that experience, but we've done many cases successfully where people don't have that experience, but they have other relevant experience that shows they can successfully, run a business. Someone's asking if my E2 application is approved on a food industry, and after a few years I want to diversify. Can I diversify? So this goes back to kind of what I was saying before, that you cannot just run and operate multiple businesses without getting approvals. So there's different things that you can do here. You can plan for an expansion in your initial business plan. You can kind of try to set it up that you're a management consulting company that provides management consulting services to multiple businesses, but you would need to kind of plan for that strategically at the start. You cannot just get the E2 and then acquire different businesses, afterwards. Um, Someone said, uh, will they be viewed kind of differently because you've obtained a Canadian citizenship only recently and now you're seeking to move to the United States? It's possible. I think I haven't had that be a major issue. That being said, it is something they could ask about. They can always ask about your ties to Canada because the E2 is a non-immigrant visa that requires intent to depart. So you should be able to demonstrate those ties to Canada. At what point in the process is best time to contact us? So I think that kind of before you've transferred any money is kind of the best time to contact us. So before you've done anything, major, is a good time to contact us. So the transfer of the money is usually kind of the hardest one to fix. But yeah, I think, as early as possible is a good idea. This person says 50,000 is the minimum. Does it include future costs? So it only includes things already spent at the time of the application. Our experiences in Frankfurt are very good. Frankfurt is a great E2 post and rather quick as well. How a startup do you stop wasting the least amount during the process? So different people kind of do different things here. Sometimes they will, kind of prepay for a lease that will start several, months in the future. What about a vehicle? Can it be ordered with a view to be delivered? Yes, like you can order things, and as long as you've paid for them, and if they're delivered in the future, that's fine. Someone's asked with the startup, does it already have to be operating? No, but it has to be ready to start operating the minute that you get your visa, or as soon as you get your visa within a reasonable time frame. Once the E2 visa is granted for an initial 5 years, can it be renewed provided the business is operational and successful? Yes, it can be renewed, and it can be renewed indefinitely as long as the business continues to meet the E2 requirements. So you do need to continue to indicate that intent to depart, but they don't view it as inconsistent to want to continue the business and also maintain those ties to your home country. All right, so thank you everyone for your great questions. If we didn't get to them because they were kind of too complex, please reach out to us at our website. The website also lists the fees for the consultation. We offer 30-minute and 1 hour consultations, and we would love to speak with you. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions. Thank you, Katie, for sharing your knowledge. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.